said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham. We have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly, I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The Son has a place there forever. So, if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Lord Christ.
As most of you know, our church, Lutheran Church, and other liturgical churches use what we call the lectionary. And the lectionary is what we call the 3-year cycle, so that last Sunday's gospel, you won't hear it again until 3 years from now. Yes. But,
Children need to go out and visit children.
oh yes, there you go.
Paul already left.
Paul already left. I should have announced that. Oh well. But there are some Sundays that are continuous every single year. They never change. Christmas, Easter, and today, Reformation Day. And these 3 holidays that clergy are supposed to preach at are the most difficult, because you think after 30 or 35 years, what's new that I could say about the Reformation? Well, I thought this morning, let's get a thumbnail sketch of the historicity of the whole thing. We know that during the time of Luther, the church had actively become involved in a secular world. Indeed, the Pope had his own army, something you can't even imagine happening today, but it was so. At the same time, the divine rights of kings was emerging. France, Spain, England, they all felt that, when it comes right down to it, I think I have more divine rights even than the Pope does. And so all of this stuff is set up. And by the time Luther comes along, there's already been a lot of fermentation going on in the background. Even 100 years before the Reformation, Jan Hus was burned at the stake for translating the Bible into his native tongue. So a lot was going on previous, even before Luther was born. And so he is born into a kind of working class family, and his father is a severe father. He's one of those hit first, ask questions later type of guys. And he's so good at it that he actually forced Luther to run away from home. So severe he was, and it was only his mother's intercession that got him back. But as Luther got older, it was clear he was a very bright, very intellectual person, and his father said, "Oh goody, let's have a lawyer in the family." Yes. Every family needs a lawyer. It would seem so today, wouldn't it? But Luther had a different idea, and indeed, riding his horse in the middle of a thunderstorm, the horse bolts, he falls to the ground, and terrified, he cries up to heaven and prays to St. Anne and says, "Help me, I will become a monk." And because he makes a vow, he keeps it, much to the chagrin of his father, who desperately does not want him to go into the monastery, but he does anyway, into the Augustinians, which is one of the most severe, austere of the orders that you could enter. And it was clear from his teachers they had a gem on their hands. He ate up Scripture. He quickly went through bachelor's, master's, into his PhD, specializing in Old Testament. But in that Old Testament came forth the God that could also love, but also could be angry. And when he thought of God the Father, the connection between his own severe father and God the Father couldn't be disconnected. And so in the monastery, he was prone to all kinds of things to prove that he loved God, oftentimes sleeping in the middle of the winter uncovered, fasting until he could hardly walk. His confessor once told him, "Luther, God isn't mad at you, you're mad at God." Luther couldn't quite figure that all out until he all of a sudden read into Romans that text that we read this morning. We're justified by faith apart from works of the law through the grace of God. And for him, it was indeed a breakthrough. Unfortunately, it wasn't much of a breakthrough for the powers of Rome at that time, because they saw this, of course, as a very distinct threat. For at that time, the old basilica in Rome was falling apart. It was time to build a new one, and the plans were massive. Not only in size and scope, but in cost. And I think most of you know the rest, the whole idea of the indulgences being sold. Luther takes umbrage at this. He tacks 95 theses to the Wittenberg church doors, which wasn't unusual, by the way. That's how you invited people into debate. You did those things, and you invited people to speak to the whole thing. I remember in confirmation talking about that. Well, I couldn't get where this kid came from. He said Luther nailed 95 theocrats to the Wittenberg door. I'm trying to picture that. It's very, very remote in my mind. But of course, it caused a big whirlwind, and Luther had to defend himself. And fortunately for him, Frederick the Wise, the elector where he lived, came to his defense, because all of these German principalities were getting just a little bit tired of sending a lot of money out of the country, and as the countries began to coalesce and become bigger, they wanted some power for themselves. You will recall what happened in England. Indeed, Luther tried to call Henry VIII to his aid. Henry VIII called him a pure heretic, and he wrote a whole defense of Catholic Church theology in which the Pope named him a defender of the faith, which they quickly took away when he divorced his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and married Anne Boleyn, whose fate we all know. Reformation was a tough time, and it was only Frederick the Wise who protected him, put him up in the castle of Wittenberg, where Luther stayed for over a year translating the Bible from German, rather from Latin into German. And all of these things have their repercussions, of course, because following all those years of persecution, the 30 Years' War, which basically decimated the countries of Germany and all of the people there, peasants dying in the fields of starvation. And you have to ask yourself, was it all worth it? Why was this so important? Why was the defense of this so incredibly important to Luther? Was it just his own problem with the severity of who God the Father was? Or was there something more at stake as to who the person of Jesus was and why he ever came to the earth? Many years ago, John Statlander, who was the pastor of the largest church in Hartford when I was first ordained, came and visited me. And he felt, well, I was newly ordained, and it would be good for a guy who had been in ministry a long time. And so we would meet weekly. We did this for over a year, and I think John was kind of testing my theology, which I thought was good, because he certainly was a learned man. And so one day we started talking about Reformation, because it was coming up and preaching. And I said, John, how do you put this in the vernacular? How do you put this in story form? Because it sounds theologically good, but sometimes it's kind of so astute and beyond human thinking. And he said, you know, a long time ago, I had another older pastor when I was young tell me this story. And he said, let's try it out. Now, in order to do this, I have to, unfortunately, choose one of you here. Oh, this is very who shall I choose? Tim Hessen. There you are. Hi, Tim. Tim, this is a Freudian dream you are having. He shakes his head. Yes, he's right. You are driving in your car, the car of life, shall we call it. And this car you try to maintain, but you're not always good to the car. You don't always do the oil changes when you should. You don't always treat it the way you should. You even let the insurance lapse once. And you're riding along through the world, because that's where we belong in our cars of life, you know. And we treat our car sometimes good, sometimes bad. It's kind of like what Luther would call saint sinner. That's how we live in our lives, traveling through the land of the world. And as you're driving along, the scenery changes. The green trees are going away slowly. Cactus appear, and then they even disappear, and you're out in the desert, Tim. Your car is running hot, and you wish you had changed the radiator antifreeze, but you didn't. and it's getting hotter, the air conditioning isn't keeping up, and you're starting to get thirsty. The thirst is almost overwhelming, and there's nothing ahead of you but desert. And off in the distance, as you look to the right, you see a tiny box, and as you get closer to it, you realize, now this is a Freudian dream, of course, you get closer to it, it's a soda machine in the middle of the desert. Absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. But by gosh, you're thirsty. So you stop the car and you think, well, we'll let that cool off. And you get out, and there's that soda machine. And you come out and you dig into your pockets and you look at the directions on the soda machine. It says, please deposit $100 in quarters. Then, to your horror, you discover there's no soda left to be given. And you say, this is a cruel joke. Until you look down at the bottom where it dispenses the soda, and there it is, 22 liters. And it's frosty. You can't believe your good fortune. And so you reach in and you pull it out, and it's cold in your hands. You put it against your face, and screw the top, and it's like fizz. But before you put it to your lips, there's a little sign attached to that bottle that says, "Hi, Tim. I knew you'd be coming." And you look up at the soda machine, and up at the top it says, "Soda dispensed by law only." And no wonder you had to have $100 in quarters. But now you've got it in your hand. And you read further, "Hello, Tim. I knew you were coming. And I knew you wouldn't have enough money to pump into this law machine. So here, Tim, drink deep. Slake your thirst. I knew what you needed before you ever stopped." That, in a way, I suppose, is a way of talking about justification by faith, that which is given to us before we even ask, and that which is just waiting for you to embrace us at any given moment, which embraces us even at those times when we think we are not embraceable. And yet it is the will of God that we would be loved, and we would be wrapped into the arms of mercy, and that all things would be good. And even as we gathered here this morning on this Reformation Day, as we stood in the back, as the prelude ended, and as you stood and faced the back to hear the words of confession and forgiveness, before you ever said the first word, it was God who said to you,